The marble floor of the courthouse felt colder than I remembered. I stood at the defendant's table in a charcoal pencil skirt I'd ironed twice that morning, hands folded in front of me, and my father's laugh cut across the room like a piece of broken glass dragged over a chalkboard. "She can't even afford a lawyer," he said, loud enough for the gallery to hear. "Look at her, standing there alone. This is what happens when you raise a daughter who thinks she's better than her family." My mother let out that little theatrical sigh she used at country club dinners when someone served the wrong wine. My older brother, sitting 2 rows behind my father in a navy suit that probably cost more than my rent, didn't even look at me. He was scrolling on his phone. I was 29 years old. I had just been served with a civil suit by my own family, alleging that I had embezzled $400,000 from my late grandmother's trust. They wanted the money back with interest, plus damages for emotional distress. The truth, of course, was that my grandmother had left me that money on purpose. She had written it into her will with a steady hand 3 weeks before she passed, and she had told me, sitting in her hospital bed with her oxygen tube taped to her cheek, that I was the only person in the family who had ever loved her without wanting something from her. But there was something else. Something none of them knew yet. I'm going to back up. My name is Marlowe Quinn Pemberton, and I was born into a family that wears its bloodline like a Rolex. The Pembertons came over on the Mayflower. Technically, though if you ask my mother, she'll trace us back further than that, to some baron in Kent who probably never existed. My father, Cordell Pemberton, ran a private equity firm in downtown Boston that had been started by his father and his father before him. My mother, Beatrice, sat on the boards of 3 museums and 1 ballet company and considered that a full-time occupation. My brother Channing was the heir. From the day he was born, that role was decided. He went to Andover, then Yale, then straight into the family firm. Everything about him had been polished by the kind of money that doesn't show off because it doesn't need to. I was the disappointment. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't the disappointment because I failed. I was the disappointment because I refused to play the part. When I was 15, I told my mother I wanted to study food science and run a restaurant someday. She actually laughed in my face. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that comes from the gut. "Darling," she said, dabbing her lip with a napkin, "we don't run restaurants. We patronize them." I went to college anyway, not Yale, a small culinary program in Providence, and I worked my way through it, waiting tables and prepping vegetables in a steakhouse kitchen 6 nights a week. My parents paid for nothing. They told everyone at their Christmas party that I was taking some time to find myself, which is what wealthy people say when their daughter is doing something embarrassing like working. I didn't open a restaurant, I opened 17 of them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The lawsuit was filed in March. The hearing was scheduled for the 2nd week of October. In between those 2 dates, my father did something I think he genuinely believed was clever. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon and asked me to meet him for dinner. Just the 2 of us. Like old times, he said, even though there had never been any old times. I went. I knew what he was doing, but I went. We met at a French place on Newbury Street, the kind with white tablecloths and a sommelier who wears gloves. He ordered for both of us without asking. He poured the wine. He waited until the appetizers came before he slid a manila envelope across the table. "This makes everything go away," he said. Inside the envelope was a settlement document. I would admit in writing that I had improperly received funds from my grandmother's estate. I would return the $400,000. I would also sign a non-disclosure agreement promising never to speak about the matter publicly. In exchange, the family would drop the suit and the matter would be closed. I read it slowly. I made him wait. "Why are you doing this?" I asked him finally. He took a sip of his wine. He had the wine glass at a precise angle, like he'd practiced it in a mirror. "Because your grandmother was not in her right mind when she wrote that will and you took advantage of her. And because if this goes to court and word gets out, it will damage the firm. People will say the Pembertons can't even keep their own house in order. She was in her right mind." "That's what you think. That's what her doctors think. That's what the witnesses to the will think." He smiled at me. It was the same smile he used to give me when I was 8 and I brought home a B- on a math test. "Sweetheart," he said, "you don't have the resources to fight this. You know that. I know that. Sign the paper, give the money back, and we'll forget the whole thing. You can keep working at your little cafe or whatever it is you do." I picked up the pen. I twirled it in my fingers for a second. He watched me do it, and I could see him relax. He thought he had me. Then I put the pen down and folded my hands. "No," I said. He blinked. He actually blinked, like a man who had not heard the word no in so long that he wasn't sure what it meant. "What?" I said. "No. I'll see you in court." I stood up, slid my napkin onto the table, and walked out before he could say anything else. The valet brought my car around and I drove home, and I sat on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and I cried for about 20 minutes. Then I made myself a grilled cheese sandwich and went to bed. The next morning I called my attorney. "You see, here is the thing my family didn't know. Here is the thing my family didn't know. Here is the thing my father, in particular, had never bothered to find out. I had not been running a little cafe. After culinary school, I had started one small place in Providence, a counter-service spot, 12 seats, where I made the kind of grain bowls and braised vegetables and warm grandmother-style stews that my actual grandmother had taught me. It was called Marigold. It did well. Then I opened a second location in Boston, then a third in Portsmouth. Then I designed a frozen meal line for upscale grocers. Then I sold the frozen meal line in cash for $92 million to a private holding company in Chicago. Then I bought back the holding company. Then I bought several other holding companies. By the time my father served me with that lawsuit, I owned a portfolio that included specialty grocers, a publishing house, 2 regional airlines, a chain of boutique hotels in the Carolinas, and a controlling interest in a New England commercial real estate firm. I had operated under a pseudonym, MQ Holdings. My signature appeared on documents as MQ Pemberton, but most of the world assumed MQ was a man. I had been on the cover of 2 business magazines, both times photographed from behind, in shadow, by my preference. I gave no interviews. I never appeared at industry events. I had a small office in a brownstone in the South End and a staff of 9 people who had each signed extensive confidentiality agreements. I had built all of this without telling anyone in my family. Not one person. Not even my grandmother, although I think she suspected. Once, near the end, she had squeezed my hand and said, "You're going to be all right, my girl." Better than all right, you don't need them. She knew. She always knew. The reason I did it this way, the reason I had stayed invisible, was simple. I did not want a single thing I built to be touchable by them. I didn't want my mother taking credit for it at her ladies' luncheons. I didn't want my brother trying to leverage it. I didn't want my father turning it into a story about how the Pemberton name had made me successful, when in fact the Pemberton name had been an anchor tied to my ankle since the day I was born. But more than that, I think I knew, even then, that one day my family would do something so brazen, so confident in my powerlessness, that I would need to show them who I actually was. That day was coming. There's one more piece you need to know. 6 months before the lawsuit was filed, my brother's firm, Pemberton Equity Partners, had taken on a significant amount of debt to finance an aggressive expansion into commercial property. They had borrowed in total about $63 million from a syndicate of lenders. One of those lenders, holding the largest tranche, was a fund called Mariposa Capital. Mariposa Capital was me. My father did not know this. My brother did not know this. They had signed the loan documents months ago and shaken hands with a managing director named Imogene Halverson, who had been hired by my firm 3 years prior, precisely because she was good at being the face of things while I stayed in the shadows. The debt had specific covenanters attached to it. One of those covenanters stated that if any senior officer of Pemberton Equity Partners became involved in civil litigation involving fraud, embezzlement, or misappropriation of funds, the lender had the right to call the loan due immediately in full. My father was a senior officer of Pemberton Equity Partners. My brother was a senior officer of Pemberton Equity Partners. They had just filed a lawsuit publicly accusing me of misappropriation. They had not realized that by doing so, They had also given me the right, as their largest creditor, to demand $63 million by close of business on any day I chose. I had chosen the day of the hearing. But I'm telling you all this now, because I want you to understand what I knew when I walked into that courtroom on the second Tuesday of October, in my charcoal pencil skirt, with my mother giving me that little sigh, and my father announcing to the gallery that I couldn't afford a lawyer. What I knew was that I owned them. All of them. And they had no idea. The courtroom was warmer than I expected. The radiator under the window was hissing. I took my seat at the defendant's table and arranged a single yellow legal pad in front of me, with a single ballpoint pen lying neatly on top. My father was at the plaintiff's table with two attorneys. One of them I recognized. His name was Bradford Holloway, the senior partner at one of the most expensive litigation firms in the city. He had silver hair combed back from a forehead the size of a dinner plate, and he wore cufflinks that caught the light when he moved. My mother sat in the front row of the gallery. She had worn pearls. She had worn pearls to her own daughter's trial. My brother sat next to her, still scrolling. Judge Marisol Quintero entered. We all stood. She was a small, sharp-featured woman in her early 60s, the kind of judge who'd been on the bench long enough to have stopped pretending to be patient with foolishness. She had a reputation in the local legal community for being unimpressed by money. I had specifically asked, when arranging things, for the case to be heard in her courtroom. "Be seated," she said. Bradford Holloway rose first. He gave a long, smooth opening statement. He spoke about my grandmother as a vulnerable, elderly woman, and described me as having isolated her in her final months and exploited her diminished capacity for personal gain. He used the phrase, predatory inheritance, twice. He gestured with his right hand in slow arcs, like he was conducting an orchestra. My father watched him with quiet satisfaction. My brother had finally put his phone away. When Holloway sat down, the judge looked at the defendant's table, at me, at the empty chair next to me. "Ms. Mummins, Pemberton," she said. "Where is your counsel?" This was the moment my father had been waiting for. I could see him sit up straighter. I could see the small smile creep into the corner of his mouth. "I represent myself today, Your Honor," I said. The smile bloomed. My father turned very slightly to share it with my mother. She rolled her eyes in a way that was meant to look exasperated but came out closer to gleeful. "She thinks she can represent herself," my father said, not quietly. "Did everyone hear that? My daughter thinks she's a lawyer now." "Mr. Morit Pemberton," the judge said without raising her voice, "I will not warn you again about decorum in my courtroom." He raised both hands in a mock surrender. Holloway whispered something to him, and he nodded. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman walked in. She was tall, perhaps 6 feet in her low heels, wearing a black suit so precisely tailored it almost disappeared on her. She had dark hair pulled into a low knot at the nape of her neck. She was carrying a slim leather portfolio under one arm. She crossed the room without hurrying, without looking at anyone except me, and she stopped at the defendant's table and stood beside my chair. I did not stand. I did not turn my head. I let her speak first. "Your Honor, my name is Imogen Halverson, and I'm here on behalf of Ms. Knight Pemberton in a related but separate matter that touches directly upon today's proceedings. I'd ask the court's permission to address the room briefly before the plaintiff's first witness." Bradford Holloway was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We've received no notice of additional counsel, and any related matter should be brought through proper channels." The judge looked at Imogen. Imogen looked back at her, calm, patient, like she had all the time in the world. "Ms. Halverson," the judge said, "what is the nature of this related matter?" "It's a matter of standing, Your Honor, specifically the financial standing of the plaintiff." The judge's eyebrows lifted. "Just slightly. Approach." They went to the bench. Holloway followed. There was a quiet conversation that lasted maybe 90 seconds. During that 90 seconds, I did not turn around, but I could feel my father's eyes on the back of my head. He was beginning, I think, to feel something he had never quite felt before, which was uncertainty. Imogen returned to the defendant's table. Holloway returned to the plaintiff's. The judge tapped her gavel once. "Counsel may proceed." Imogene opened her portfolio. She did not raise her voice. Your Honor, this morning at 6 a.m., my firm, acting on behalf of Mariposa Capital, the largest creditor of Pemberton Equity Partners, formally called due the entirety of Pemberton's outstanding $63 million loan. The covenant triggering this demand is the litigation covenant, which was activated by the very lawsuit being heard in this courtroom today. The plaintiff is, as of approximately 90 minutes ago, in technical default on a debt that exceeds the total liquid assets of his firm and his personal holdings combined. Additionally, we have filed for immediate asset preservation orders against all senior officers of the plaintiff's firm pending resolution of the default. You could have heard a paperclip drop. My father's face went the color of old paper. Holloway turned to look at him. The look was the kind of look a lawyer gives a client when he realizes the client did not tell him something he very much needed to know. Mariposa, my father said. He said it too loudly. Mariposa? That's a Chicago fund. That has nothing to do with this. It has everything to do with this, Imogene said. Because Mariposa Capital is a wholly owned subsidiary of MQ Holdings, and MQ Holdings is owned entirely and solely by your daughter. Holloway took a single step back from his table. Just one. But I saw it. He stared at me. I felt his stare like a hand on my face. He had been a Boston attorney for 40 years. He had been around the kind of money that operates quietly, the kind that doesn't put its name on buildings. He knew what MQ Holdings was. Everybody in the financial circles of the city knew vaguely that MQ Holdings existed, even if no one knew who ran it. My God, Holloway said. His voice came out rough. Is that really her? Is that you? I finally turned my head to look at him. I gave him a small, almost gentle nod. He sat down. He did not look at my father. My father's hands were trembling on the table in front of him. He pressed them flat against the wood, but I could see them shaking through his sleeves. This is a lie, he said. This is some kind of trick. This is Marlowe. What have you, Mr. Pemberton, the judge said. Her voice had gone very, very quiet. Sit down. He sat. He sat heavily, like the air had gone out of him. The judge looked at Imogene for a long moment, and then at me. Miss Pemberton, she said, it appears the basis for the plaintiff's claim, and indeed the plaintiff's capacity to bring this claim, has shifted considerably in the last few minutes. Would you like to respond to the plaintiff's opening statement, or would you prefer to address procedural matters first? I stood up. I straightened my skirt. I looked at my father. He did not look back at me. He was looking at the table. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to read a brief statement, and then I'd like to call my first witness. Proceed. I picked up my legal pad. I had not written anything on it. I didn't need to. My grandmother's name was Hazel Pemberton. She was 87 years old when she died. In the last year of her life, when she was sick and tired and frightened, the only person who came to see her in the hospital was me. Not her son, not her daughter-in-law, not her grandson. Me. I came on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Sundays, and I brought her the soup she liked, the one her own mother used to make, and I read her the gardening magazines she preferred over the news because the news upset her. She was lucid until the day she died. Her doctors will testify to that. Her hospice nurses will testify to that. Her priest will testify to that. The lawyer who drafted her will, 3 weeks before her death, will testify to that. I paused. I looked at my mother. My mother looked at her hands. My grandmother left me $400,000 because I was the only person who loved her. She told me in her own words that the rest of the family would only fight over it if she left it to all of them, and she wanted at least one person in the family to feel chosen. So she chose me, and my father, who could not stand the idea that I had been chosen for anything by anyone, decided to take it back. I set the legal pad down. I am not contesting the lawsuit, Your Honor. I am moving for dismissal on the basis that the plaintiff has no standing to bring this claim, given the financial circumstances Ms. Halverson has just outlined. And once this matter is dismissed, I will be filing a counterclaim for malicious prosecution, abuse of process, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I sat down. The judge ruled within 20 minutes. The case was dismissed. The asset preservation orders were granted. By Thursday of that week, the firm my grandfather had built, the firm my father had inherited, the firm my brother had been groomed since birth to lead, was in receivership. By the end of the month, I owned it. I had purchased the distressed assets through one of my holding companies for a price that, my accountants told me, would clear me a small profit even after all the legal fees. The first phone call came from my mother. She left a voicemail. She had been crying. She wanted to talk things through. She said she had always loved me, even when she didn't show it, and she hoped I knew that. I didn't return the call. The second call was from my brother. He was less composed than my mother had been. He shouted into the voicemail for almost 2 minutes. He called me names I had not heard him use since we were children. Then he started crying too, and then he hung up. I didn't return that call either. The third call was from my father. It came on a Sunday evening about 3 weeks after the hearing. I was in my kitchen making a chicken stock from a carcass I had saved in the freezer when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick it up. "Marlo," he said. His voice was different. I had never heard it like this. It was small and wet and old. "Father, I want to come and see you. I want to talk to you." I considered it. I stood at the stove with the wooden spoon in my hand and I watched the bones bob gently in the simmering water. "All right," I said. He came the next day, in the afternoon. He arrived in a cab. He had never taken a cab in his life, as far as I knew. He came up the steps of my brownstone, the brownstone he had no idea I owned, and he stood on the front stoop in a coat that suddenly looked a size too big for him. I let him in. I made him tea. We sat in my kitchen, at the small wooden table where I ate breakfast every morning. He looked around. He looked at the copper pots hanging from the rack, and the cookbooks lined up on the shelf, and the small framed photograph of my grandmother that I kept above the sink. He started crying. Quietly. He did not try to hide it. "I never knew you," he said. "All these years, I never knew you at all." I poured the tea. I set the cup in front of him. I sat down across the table. "No," I said. "You didn't." He nodded. He didn't argue. We sat there for a long time. I let him cry. I did not get up to comfort him. I did not say it was all right, because it was not all right. I did not tell him I forgave him because I was not sure I did, but I did tell him this. I told him that he could come back if he wanted to the next Sunday, and the Sunday after that. I told him that I would not give him a single dollar and I would not return the firm and I would not pretend that what had happened had not happened, but that if he wanted to know me finally I would let him try. He came the next Sunday. And the one after that, my mother and my brother have never reached out again, not really. They sent letters through their lawyers asking for various things and I responded through mine. Eventually they stopped. I hear through people who know people that my mother no longer attends the museum board meetings, and that my brother has moved to Florida and works in real estate for someone else's company. I do not wish them harm. I do not wish them anything. My father comes every Sunday. He helps me chop vegetables. He has learned, slowly, to make a passable bechamel. He doesn't talk much. Neither do I. We don't need to. Sometimes, when I'm standing at the stove and he's setting the table behind me, I think about my grandmother. I think about that day in the hospital, when she squeezed my hand and told me I didn't need them. She was right, I never did. But it turns out that some of them, in their own broken way, eventually needed me. And that, I have decided, is its own kind of justice. Not loud, not theatrical. Just quiet and steady and absolutely my own. I've thought a lot about that Sunday evening, the one when my father called me with a voice I didn't recognize. I was at the stove with a wooden spoon in my hand, and I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't, not because the conversation changed anything that had already happened, but because it taught me something I had been circling around for years without quite landing on. Every choice we make is a seed. My father planted his seeds for 30 years. He planted contempt every time he laughed at my dreams. He planted entitlement every time he assumed his name was enough. He planted cruelty every time he decided that I, his own daughter, was a thing to be managed rather than a person to be known. And then, one autumn morning, he walked into a courtroom and tried to harvest a fortune from the soil he had been poisoning my whole life, and he was genuinely shocked when nothing grew. That, to me, is the law that no one can argue with. Not the law of any courtroom. The law of what you put into the world coming back to find you in its own time, dressed in its own clothes. But here is the part I want my children to understand someday, if I ever have any. Living well is not the same as living loud. For 10 years I built something quietly. I did not tell my mother. I did not tell my brother Channing. I did not put my name on a single building. I worked and I learned. And I let the people who underestimated me keep underestimated me, because every time they did, I grew a little stronger. That is what nerve really is. It is not shouting, it is staying steady when no one is clapping. And the thing about decency is that it isn't soft. My grandmother taught me that. She was the kindest woman I ever knew, and she was also the strongest, because she chose again and again to love people who didn't deserve it without letting them touch the part of her that was hers alone. She held the line. That is what I try to do now. When my father cried at my kitchen table, I did not tell him it was all right. I will not pretend something is healed when it isn't. But I let him chop the carrots, and I let him come back the next week, because I believe that a person can change if they are willing to do the small, unglamorous work of changing. And I do not have it in me to slam the door on a man who is finally, at 63 years old, trying to learn what humility tastes like. The world will tell you that revenge is loud. It isn't. Real justice is quiet. It is a stock pot simmering on a Sunday. It is a signature on a document no one knew you held. It is choosing every single morning to be the person your grandmother believed you could be, long after she's gone. That is the inheritance she actually left me. The money was just paper.